Okay, Manum S is already telling me we are live, thank you. And welcome everybody. If you could all confirm that you can hear me and you can see the board, that would be nice, so that I know this is working for everybody. I'll wait a little for everybody to catch the stream and then we'll begin. Okay, this is looking good. Thank you for the feedback here. Swagderp, Manum S, Apocalypse, Yeehaw, and also Digestical. It's good to see some familiar names here from our Prodigy program. So I'm going to follow both chats, or at least I'll try to follow both the Twitch chat and the YouTube chat. But as you can see, I'm only embedding the Twitch chat here in the video, so only that will be recorded. So I'm regarding the Twitch chat as the main one and YouTube as the backup one, but feel free to use any that works for you. Okay, so let's begin then. Welcome everybody. My name is Arne Jochens. I'm a FIDE Master from Germany. I am Director of Content at chessuniversity.com and also one of the lead instructors there. And today we have a little free seminar. All in all, this is going to be about 1 hour long. And then, as you probably know, there's also a second one after this one, but they are intended for different target audiences. But of course, since they are free, if you want to, you can also attend both. So this first one is intended for players mainly in the 1500 to 2000 ELO rating range. And our topic here is understanding the isolated queen's pawn structure. Now, to show you what I mean by that exactly, I have set up this skeleton position here. So this is not supposed to be a king and pawn endgame. Imagine most of the pieces are still on the board and they are in some typical positions. But here I have just set up the pawn structure because this is what I wanted to emphasize in the beginning. This is the kind of pawn structure that we're interested in here, where white or black has a d pawn on the 4th rank, or if black had the pawn then on the 5th rank, of course, and white has no c or e pawns, so the pawn on d4 is isolated. This is the defining feature of this pawn structure, and also the fact that black has no c and d pawns. So the pawn is on a half-open file, but it is not a passed pawn, because whenever it advances to d5, it could potentially still be captured by this black pawn. So this structure is what we call the isolated queen's pawn structure, or IQP for short. And the precise position of the flank pawns does not matter so much. So for example, this pawn could be on a2 or a3 or a4, and the same about black's a and b pawns, white's other b pawn, and the king side pawns. We would still call this an IQP structure. And this structure is very important because it can arise from a huge number of openings. I guess most of you have some openings in their repertoire that could lead to this type of structure, or the same type of structure with colors reversed, where black has the IQP. For example, this position here could arise from a queen's gambit declined, could also arise from some lines in the English opening, or from the Caro-Kann defense. Also in the French opening, there are some lines where black gets the isolated queen's pawn, or I suppose also where white gets the isolated queen's pawn if white plays an exchange French, and so on. There's really a large number of openings that can lead to this structure. And that's why it's very useful to be familiar with the typical plans in this structure for both sides. And there are some typical plans. As with most pawn structures, the pawn structure to some extent defines the plans for both sides. Of course, the plans will also depend on where precisely the pieces are, but because of the pawn structure, there are certain typical squares where the pieces will often go to, because this is where they are best placed. And because of that, the plans will be very similar for different positions with the same structure. So let's look at an example of one of the two most important plans for white to begin with. This is a position from an old game played by Boris Spassky with white when he was 12 years old, from the Leningrad Junior Championship in 1949. And his opponent was someone called Avtonomov. Now it was white to move in this position. You can see white has the isolated queen's pawn here on d4. And you may also note that white has a lead in development. White has developed both knights, the bishop and the queen, and also the rook is already well placed, because behind this IQP it supports the pawn, it defends the pawn as long as it is on d4, but also once the pawn advances, the rook will still support it. And black has also developed 3 pieces, but no rook, and also black has not castled yet. And this is in fact the most important feature of the position. The black king is still on e8, and now you can probably guess, with the white queen already on e2, indirectly attacking this king. And also in general, whenever you have a lead in development, you should try to open up the position. And in this IQP structure, the typical way for white to open up the position is to play this central breakthrough, d4 to d5. Whenever there is no black piece on d5 blockading this pawn, this is a move that always has to be calculated, because this is the principal break that white has in the position, and it will often serve to activate all the white pieces. By the way, the chat is very quiet at the moment, so maybe I should mention, if you have any questions, you can always ask right away. I will always try to keep an eye on both chats and try to answer your questions. I should also mention, we will do about 40 minutes of a lecture style thing where I'm talking and also already answering some questions, but then towards the end, the last third or so of the hour, we will have an open Q&A period where you can ask any questions. But already during the first 2/3, feel free to ask questions that are relevant to the positions I'm showing and relevant to the things I'm talking about. So white plays this move d5, and this is a great move because now white is activating his pieces. Note that once the pawn gets to d5, this bishop is getting stronger because there is more pressure down this diagonal now. Also the knight's influence is increased because now the knight may be able to capture on d5, and also the scope of this rook is increased. So this is a very typical outcome of this break d4, d5. The scope of many of white's pieces is increased. Creeper Bine has a question, and we will return to that. But first let's look at the game, what happened after d5. So, of course, white is threatening to take on e6. Note that this would also discover the attack of this rook against the black queen. So black has to capture on d5. Now if he takes with this knight, then we can just attack the other knight, and black already loses a piece, because as soon as this knight moves, the other one will be hanging. Of course the e-pawn is pinned. So he can't do that. If he captures with the bishop, then white would play bishop g5, and this is pretty similar to the game, could even transpose to the game. So let me just show you what happened in the game. Black took with the knight from b4. Now white plays bishop g5. So now both knights are pinned. Black tries to complete his development, maybe get ready to castle and unpin this knight, but it's already too late. White captures this knight. Now the bishop cannot capture because then the e-pawn would again be pinned, and if you count the number of attackers and defenders, you will see that the knight on d5 would just be hanging. So he has to capture with the pawn, And now white just exchanges on d5 twice. So black has to recapture with the pawn. So now black's pawn structure has been severely weakened, and, well, white still keeps the initiative. Now he plays knight to d4. The knight is heading for f5. So for example, if black castles in this position, then knight f5 is winning, because there is an attack against the bishop, but also there is a threat of queen g4 check, followed by queen g7 checkmate. So black cannot even castle anymore, so he tries king f8 to unpin the bishop, but still knight f5 is powerful. Again hitting the bishop and again preparing an eventual queen g7. So black tries, well, this time the bishop is not attacked right away, so he can try to defend against queen g4, which is what he does with h5. But now white has a nice tactic. Rook takes d5 based on queen takes d5, and now he can take the bishop and take on f6, threatening checkmate, and also threatening knight e7 with a fork. And black can't defend against both threats. So the end was very tactical, but this is not surprising that all the tactics basically worked in white's favor from this position, because white already had this great lead in development, and by playing d5 he was able to increase the lead in development and to open up the position, so this was practically winning. So let me get to the questions here. I don't think this was a Ruy Lopez. This was in fact a Queen's Gambit accepted. The game started 1 d4, d5, c4, d takes c4, and so on. But as I mentioned, this kind of position can arise from many openings. Although, yeah, in the Ruy Lopez, I'm not sure which line would lead to such a position. I don't have any example from that opening in mind. And there was a question about knight e5. Knight e5 is also a typical move in this structure, because based on the pawn on d4, white usually has very good control over this e5 square. And black would be very reluctant to ever play f6, because this would always weaken his e6 pawn. So knight e5 is a typical move. It's just that in this particular position d5 is already a winning move. So d5 is the best move. Knight e5 is not as forcing, and maybe then black would have time to complete his development. Yeah, good point by Chessmaster Junior. This cannot be a Ruy Lopez because the black e-pawn is still on e6. So yes, from this position, after d5, white was already winning. There was a question by Merkiam that I missed earlier. What if rook g8 to stop queen g4? Let's look at that. In the position after taking on f6, exchanging on d5, knight d4. Well, I suppose you mean after knight f5. So let's say king f8, as I showed as the game went, knight f5. Well, this is pretty similar, I think. Black played h5 to stop queen g4. If he plays rook g8 to stop queen g4, well, we have to think if the combination, the same combination still works. Yeah, I think here it works even better, because after rook takes d5, black cannot take the rook at all, because in that case queen takes e7 would immediately be checkmate. The rook on g8 is blocking that square, so the black king has less space to escape. And if the queen goes anywhere else, well, then white can at the very least activate his other rook, and black is still not coordinating his pieces. Now white would be threatening rook d7, so this is also winning for white. Okay, so now you may say maybe this was just so strong, the move d4 d5, because black hadn't castled yet. And to some extent this was true about that position. But let me show you that this break, this central break d4 d5, can also be very strong when the opponent has already castled. So here it seems much less clear. White has a small lead in development again, because both white rooks are well placed and well centralized and connected, whereas the black rooks are not yet connected. In other words, black has not yet found a good square for his queen. But apart from that, black is also well developed, and he has already castled. This is from a game Vaganyan against Leki from the European Senior Championship 2016. And again, there is no black piece on d5, so we should consider this move d4 d5. And this is indeed what white played. And again, note that this increases the scope of several of white's pieces. All of these pieces increase their activity once the pawn gets to d5. And of course white is threatening to take on c6 or to take on e6, so black has to capture on d5. It doesn't matter how he captures, because white is going to exchange anyway. So white exchanges the pawn and the knight. And now he doesn't want to exchange queens. This is also generally true. The side with the isolated queen's pawn usually doesn't want to exchange too many pieces, and especially not the queen, because, well, in this position white wants to play for an attack. And in fact in this position black already resigned, because he saw that white's activity is now so great that he cannot defend everything. To begin with, there is already a threat to sacrifice the bishop on f7, which is a weak spot in black's position, not being defended by any piece except the king. And then white could, for example, follow up with queen b3 check, exposing the attack of this rook against the black queen. So white would already win a pawn and the queen for a rook and a minor piece at least. So bishop takes f7 is already a winning threat. And let's say black tried to defend against that threat with rook f8. Well, then white could renew the threat with a move such as queen f5, bringing the queen closer to the king's side and again threatening bishop takes f7, winning the queen. There just is no defense for black, because his queen still doesn't have a safe square. I don't want to go into too much detail here. If you're not convinced, you can play around with this position maybe after the lesson. But white is really completely winning simply because his pieces are so active here. So this is one of the two most important plans for white in this position. Push the IQP to open up the position, and often this will result in a position where the white pieces are more active than the black pieces. And in such a completely open position, when you have the more active pieces, this will often be decisive. Yeah, knight g5 is also a typical attacking move. This could also have been tried in the original position here. This is indeed also an interesting move. But again, d5 is so strong in this position that I think it is the best move, because it's practically winning by force. But if d5 for some reason did not work, then I would consider knight g5, also a typical attacking move, putting pressure on both of these spots. And a typical follow-up would be queen h3, for example, and then find some way to exchange this knight on f6, maybe with knight e4. And this could also lead to a very strong attack. So this is in fact white's other main plan in the position. If you can't push the pawn, then you should usually still try to go for a kingside attack. by bringing your pieces over in some way. But before we look at that in more detail, let me mention that sometimes the pawn is not on the 4th but on the 5th rank. So this is an example from a line in the English opening, the so-called Floor-Mikenas attack, where white to move can now push the IQP to d5. Also note that here we have a slightly different IQP structure to begin with, because black has a c-pawn instead of an e-pawn. But the most important difference is that here white can push the pawn to d5 without the pawn being exchanged right away. And now black may retreat the bishop. He could retreat the bishop to d7, but the main move in this position is even retreat the bishop all the way so that b7 is defended and the knight can still come to d7. And then we have the position where the IQP is on the 5th rank, and this usually favors white, because here white has a huge space advantage in the center. So having the pawn on the 5th rank without it being exchanged tends to be even better than having it on the 4th rank. That's why black would usually play the move c6, or if he had an e-pawn, the move e6 quite early in the opening. And if we fast forward some moves from here, we can look at a position that arose from that, where the pawn is still on d5. This is a game Larry Christensen against Manuel Bravo from the Torre Memorial Tournament in 1998. And again, pushing the pawn even further can be very strong. So here white played d6 to activate his pieces, in particular having in mind the idea bishop b3 to target f7. So you can see this is very similar to the previous example now. The position here would still not be so clear if black had captured with the c-pawn, but he captured with the bishop, and now white is winning, because now knight takes f7 just works. Based on king takes f7, bishop b3 check, king f8, queen d5, threatening mate on 2 squares here, and there is no defense. So black tried the best move, bishop takes c2, but he's still losing some material now. Knight takes d6, c takes d6, queen takes c2. Or maybe not by force, maybe he can hold on to the material for the time being, but white now just has the better pawn structure and the more active pieces. So at least the position is clearly better for white. There was a question in the YouTube chat, does g6 work after the queen went to f5? But okay, Ryan already answered that, so thank you. And Ryan in the other chat also mentions the sacrifice on f7. Yeah, as we saw here, the sacrifice on f7 is indeed a key idea. And of course, if there's a pawn on e6, a black pawn that is, if there's a black pawn on e6 instead of a black c-pawn, sometimes the sacrifice may be on e6. And Yeehaw asks, can you use the c-pawn to undermine the d-pawn? Yeah, this is what black should do in principle, or should try to do in this position. He should try to find a good moment to play c6 and maybe exchange the pawns. But you have to be very careful, because as we saw, when the position opens up, this will benefit the player with the more active pieces. So before black can play c6, he should try to catch up in development here. Well, maybe you say black is not really behind in development, but to my mind he is a little behind in development, because it's white to move in this position, and also the knight on c3 is better placed than the knight on g6, because it controls 2 central squares. So white will play bishop d3, and now before he can contemplate to challenge this pawn, black should catch up in development first. Okay, so let's look at a case where white cannot just play d4, d5. then of course it's more complicated. So this is also naturally what black should try to do in this type of position. He should try to make sure that the break d4, d5 does not work. Now, one way to make sure that it doesn't work is to have very good development, so that when white plays this break, you can just take and open up the position confidently because you also have active pieces. But in many openings, especially when white has the IQP, this will not really be possible. So then what black needs to do is he needs to control the d5 square. And often the best way to control it is to put a piece there, to blockade the pawn. In this way, at least black is making sure that white cannot push the pawn. So this white plan we just looked at, the central break, is ruled out here. We are going to follow a game Lei Tao against Sleepak here. And it was white to move in this position, again from a Queen's Gambit accepted opening, but it could also arise from other openings. So what can white do if he cannot push d5? Of course he could exchange on d5, but this would just lead to a very equal position. And also black has already anticipated this exchange by putting the rook on e8. So if white exchanges, say, the knights, then we get a completely symmetrical pawn structure. And then there is no reason why white should be better here. He would have to move the queen again very soon to get out of this rook's range. And he doesn't really have a lead in development, so there's no reason to think white could be better in that case. So if white wants to play for the advantage, he shouldn't exchange on d5 in this very position. And as I already mentioned, the plan for white, if he can't push the pawn, is to play for a kingside attack. Because of this pawn on d4, white has a slight space advantage in the center. And in particular, as we already mentioned, he controls the e5 square. So he can maybe later put a knight there. And, well, if there's a knight on e5, that could be a good basis for a kingside attack, because the knight would already put pressure on f7, as we already saw in previous examples. But also if black exchanges on e5, then white will have a pawn on e5, so then the structure will be transformed. But in that structure, with the pawn on e5, white will have a space advantage on the king side. And this could also be a good reason to attack on the king side. For one thing, black won't be able to put a defensive knight on f6, because white will control the f6 square with his pawn. And also because of the central space advantage, it's easier for white to bring more pieces to the king side, or to bring many pieces to the king side quickly, than it is for black. For example, once this knight moves, there's a typical way to bring this rook over to the king side via the third rank. And black can obviously not do the same, because his third rank is blocked by the e6 pawn. Yeah, knight e4 would also be a good start here, because knight e4, as suggested here in the chat, would bring this knight closer to the king side. So this is certainly a move to consider here. But white came up with another interesting move. Well, I think the players still knew this position as part of their opening repertoires. He played h4. Very interesting move, because this also supports a kingside attack in two potential ways. Either this pawn move could be used to gain a stronghold on g5, so maybe white wants to follow up with either knight or bishop to g5, and if he puts the knight on g5, the queen could come to h5. So that could be one benefit of playing this pawn move. Or he can just push the pawn even further to try to induce a weakness in black's position. And this is indeed what happens in this game. Now, First question here should be, can black not just win the pawn? Well, he can take the pawn, but in doing so he would have to give up his dark squared bishop. And this can be serious because the dark squared bishop with this central structure tends to be a very important piece for black. Now the white dark squared bishop can potentially become very strong. Well, black can try to... yeah, he would have to take on c3 first, right? Because if he takes on h4 right away, the rook is no longer defended. So white could just win a piece here. So if he wants to win the pawn, black would have to exchange on c3 first. And then we would have another transformation of the structure. And this often happens from the isolated queen's pawn structure. There's often this exchange of knights on c3, and then white gets a new c-pawn that will usually advance to c4 if possible. And then we will have the so-called hanging pawn structure. But that's a different topic. This is another well-known structure where there are also typical plans which are quite similar to the ones with the IQP, but of course there are some differences. But that would be a topic for another lesson. But here it's very concrete. Black would have to recapture on h4. So now black has won a pawn, but at some cost, because he has exchanged his two most active pieces, and white now has the two bishops, and it's white to move. And as you will note, black no longer blockades the d-pawn. So again we should consider this breakthrough d5. Here it is not winning, because black doesn't have to take, he can just move the knight. White will want to keep the two bishops, and well, in this position we can conclude that white certainly has compensation for the pawn, because he still has the more active pieces, he has the two bishops, and the knight on a5 is not well placed, and also black still has not completed his queenside development. But it's a complicated position. I'm not saying this is clearly bad for black. But you can probably understand that black didn't want to do this. It's usually harder to play such passive positions than to play the active side. So he didn't take on h4. Yeah, Chessmaster Junior makes a good point. Because white wants to play for the kingside attack, usually he doesn't want to exchange minor pieces. But this line I just showed was an exception to that rule, because in that line black exchanged his two most active minor pieces. And in this way white's initiative was increased. So now, yes, this is as Simon Williams and I guess all the English players like to call him, Harry the H-pawn. He now advances even further. Well, first of all, it's black to move. He plays a typical move for black in this structure, knight c to b4, to add another piece to his control of the d5 square. And in this way he can, for example, prepare this exchange, knight takes c3, when he would still have control over the d5 square. And white plays h5, b6. This is another typical move, aiming to control d5 with yet another piece. The bishop on c8 is often quite passive in this structure, so if you get a chance to bring it to the long diagonal, this is often a very sensible thing to do for black. In particular, since this long diagonal includes the blockading square d5. But here we can observe one drawback of this move, knight c to b4. Now black is no longer challenging the e5 square, so now knight e5 is a very natural move. Now white can play this move without worrying about the exchange of knights. Bishop b7, a5, gaining a little space on the queen side as well, b5, and now this move h6. Of course, black doesn't want to open up his king, so he plays g6. But now this pawn is quite annoying for black. Not only could there later be back rank problems, because the black king doesn't have any squares on the 7th rank available, but also the fact that this pawn controls the g7 square is potentially problematic for black. And having forced this move g6, white has weakened the f6 square. So white can now try to bring a piece to f6. So let's see how he does that. First of all, he plays knight e4, avoiding the exchange and already getting one piece in contact with that square. Rook c8. Of course, for the moment, black is still controlling f6 with 3 pieces. So there is no immediate problem there. White plays bishop e3. This is not a great spot for the bishop, but it didn't have any better square, and white wanted to connect the rooks. And as we said, in general, white doesn't want to exchange pieces, but for this bishop he would make an exception, because in this structure where the pawn, the IQP, is on a dark square, the dark squared bishop is just not very active. It would be different, of course, if it could somehow get to f6, but well, this is just not possible here. Bishop g5 would just be hanging. So white just puts the bishop on e3. And this can be useful because it increases white's control over the c5 square. So this can be a way to prepare this move, knight c5. There was a question by Sergey Smart. Why not first take d5 takes e6 and then pull back white's bishop to c2? Okay, let's go back to that line where black captured the pawn on h4. I guess that was the line. And then white pushed the pawn to d5. Yeah, this is an interesting question. Can white offer to sacrifice this bishop? In other words, is he now threatening to take on f7? Well, I suppose he is threatening to take on f7, but only because this pawn is supported by the bishop. Once black takes the bishop, then taking on f7 can just be met with king takes f7, I think. So now white has sacrificed a piece. He has exposed the black king, but I don't really see how you bring more pieces into the attack from here. Also, your queen is attacked. And you cannot win the knight with queen a2 or queen c4 check, because bishop e6 will defend the knight. So I feel you don't have enough compensation here. We can still look at the forcing move rook d7 check, but the black king will be safe after rook e7 or just king back. So this doesn't quite work. But sometimes such a piece sacrifice can work, so it's good that you mentioned this move. I should have done so myself. Sometimes you can sacrifice a piece and just keep on capturing things with the d-pawn that you pushed. This can sometimes be very strong. But in this position it just doesn't quite work. Ah, sorry, I forgot about the queen on h4 in that line. Yeah, queen c4 can of course just be met. Where was I? Queen c4 can of course just be met by queen takes c4. But bishop e6 is still important in case of queen a2. Then I guess black would play bishop e6. But in any case, this line doesn't work for white. So going back to the game, after bishop e3, black did exchange on e3, queen takes, and played the other knight to d5. Now the queen comes to g3. So this is a typical maneuver, somehow getting the queen to the king side for white, because this will increase his attacking chances on the king side. Black plays bishop a8. Don't ask me why, maybe he was anticipating a future knight c5, but I'm not sure. Knight g4. And now white wants to play queen e5. And then there will be a threat to take on d5 and put a knight into f6, winning the rook here. Yeah, f6 is in fact, I think, more or less the only move here, because queen e5 is a very strong threat that you have to prevent. So f6 is a way to try to not only prevent queen e5, but also get rid of this weakness on f6, because now there are more ways to defend f6. Now even the king could sometimes help to defend f6, and also the rook could now help to defend f6. But of course there's a problem with this move, which is that now the e6 pawn is weakened, and also the whole diagonal here is weakened. So the strength of this bishop is increased by the move f6. So can white exploit that? First he plays rook a to c1, activating or at least exchanging his only piece that was not too active yet. Rook takes, rook f8. Okay, so black has managed to defend f6, but now e6 is a new weakness. So white plays knight to c5. And well, now black is close to losing, so he has to be very careful. Maybe he is losing already, because e6 is now a serious weakness, and I don't really see how he can defend it satisfactorily. He could try to defend it with queen c8, but then white will just attack it again. He could also try to defend by exchanging the knight, either immediately or in this position. But this would increase the power of this pawn, and also the white queen is still threatening to come to d6, for example. And black cannot prevent that. The rook cannot prevent it because he needs to keep defending f6. If the rook comes to d8, say, white could just take on d5 and then take on f6. But also the queen cannot really prevent queen d6, say queen c6, white will still play queen d6. Because after an exchange, this pawn is very powerful and there are still two weaknesses here in black's position. And black cannot defend them both at once. So this might, yeah, I think this is also winning for white. Well, in the game it was even worse in a way, because he played bishop d6. And now a very nice move from white. Instead of reacting to this attack, he still takes on e6. This of course had to be well calculated, attacking the black queen. And based on the line, if black takes the white queen, white takes the black queen. And if black recaptures, then we recapture on g3. And now this pin is extremely bad for black. The fact that the knight is now pinned means that f6 is still hanging to start with, but also if the knight is unpinned, say with king f8, the white rook will get into black's position. And this is interesting because you might think that with so many exchanges, black should by now have neutralized white's initiative. But this is not true. Even with such reduced material, if white keeps the more active pieces, his initiative can still be decisive. And this is the case here. White has the much more active pieces, still threatening this pawn, threatening this pawn. Not to mention the fact that white has an extra pawn at this moment already. So this would be winning for white. Well, he played queen e7 instead of taking the white queen. Knight f4, hitting the knight which is pinned a second time. Queen e4, and now white exchanges on d5. And now the bishop is pinned, at least on one diagonal, and white can play a very nice move. Again ignoring the threat against his queen, playing knight to e3. And now white is just winning. The game concluded. Bishop takes c3, bishop takes d5, regaining the queen, of course. Takes, and again white keeps the much more active pieces and an extra pawn. Black has to save his bishop. This gives white time to activate the rook, so he wins the second pawn. Well, I suppose he could take on a6, but he prepares to go for the initiative instead. Knight f6, king h8. And now he takes on a6. And well, he's ready to exchange his d-pawn for black's b-pawn, because this would give him two connected passed pawns with an easy win. Just don't fall for the back rank checkmate. g3, bishop c7, rook c6, and black resigned. Now his bishop is even pinned, but even if he had not walked into this pin, white is winning here because he's going to take on b5. And the two connected passed pawns win easily when black has no counterplay. So this was a nice game. Of course, black could have defended better. In this position, white was not winning by force. Also in the position we started with, let me go back all the way. In this position, of course, white was not winning by force. But this was an interesting attacking setup, pushing the h-pawn all the way to h6 to induce this weakening of the f6 square. And then white was threatening to just bring many pieces in contact with that square, and this provoked black into playing f6. And as soon as that happened, there was a new weakness on e6. This made the bishop very powerful, and combining an attack against the weakness on e6 and the blockading piece on d5, white was able to increase his initiative. Yeah, this was a very good game by Rafael Leitao. So, okay, we're running short of time, but I want to at least briefly show you an example of what black should be aiming for. This is a position that arose in a game Karpov against Spassky. So, well, again, white is better, but you will see that this time white is playing against the IQP. So this is an example of what the side playing against the IQP should aim for. As we already mentioned, the side having the IQP doesn't want to exchange too many pieces, especially not exchange too many minor pieces. And conversely, of course, the side playing against the IQP wants to exchange the minor pieces. And here white has already exchanged two knights, which is good for him. And he would also like to exchange all the bishops. A major piece endgame is usually very favorable for the side playing against the IQP, because then you can just put pressure on the pawn with your pieces. And also without any minor pieces, the chances of a kingside attack are pretty slim. So white has already achieved something here, and now the typical plan for white is, well, first of all, as you know, always keep in mind that d4 is a potential threat. So always calculate this move unless you just want to blockade that square. But Karpov was confident that d4 doesn't work in this position because his bishop controls d4 and the black bishop doesn't. And then the plan is just to put as much pressure as possible on this pawn. Regard this pawn as a weakness that you want to attack. It is an isolated pawn after all, so it cannot be defended by any other pawn. So white starts by doubling rooks on the d-file. Very logical. The bishop here is already very well placed, putting pressure on that pawn. This rook was also well placed, but white wants to include the second rook in the attack against that pawn. Well, black has to defend, but white just increases the pressure as much as possible. So now the queen also wants to attack the pawn. And as you may know, if you want to triple your major pieces on some file, it's usually best to have the queen behind the rooks, because the queen is the most valuable piece. This is the setup known as Aljechin's gun, because he introduced, well, I don't know about introducing, but he won some famous game with this setup. So white has attacked the pawn with all the pieces that can attack it. Only the dark squared bishop, of course, cannot attack the pawn, but it's still doing a good job here of helping to control the blockading square. b6. But now the question is, how can white make progress? He has increased the pressure against d5 to the maximum, but black is still defending it. So how can we make progress? There's a general rule for this kind of situation. When your opponent has a weakness and you have done all you can to increase the pressure against that weakness, but your opponent is still holding it. There's a general rule of how to make progress in such situations. Maybe some of you know that rule. I'm not sure about bishop b4, let's say in the original position that we started with. Well, here if we play bishop b4, I think black can just take, right? Winning a pawn. So maybe you had a different position in mind. Ah, okay, maybe you had this position in mind. You want to follow up with rook d4. But I wouldn't like to exchange the d5 pawn for one of white's queenside pawns, because in this position I already think white is clearly better, because black has no trace of a kingside attack, and also he can't play d4. So both of black's natural plans are prevented, and the exchanges of the knights and the fact that white is going to control the d-file, this means that d5 is just a weakness. So why exchange one of your opponent's weaknesses for one of your own healthy pawns? I don't think that white would have so much activity as to claim any real advantage in the resulting position. Yeah, Algeciras makes a very good comment here. The principle of two weaknesses. This is extremely relevant to this position. Black has one clear weakness on d5. And white has increased the pressure against that weakness to the maximum. But black is still defending it. So what white should do is he should look for a second weakness in black's position. And ideally the second weakness should be very far from the first weakness. And then white can attack both weaknesses in turn, and this will usually mean that black cannot keep defending them both. And in this case, the second weakness that white is looking for is going to be the black king. So this is very typical. Once the side playing against the IQP has managed to control the position and to force black to defend the pawn with all his pieces basically, then the side playing against the IQP can think about the kingside attack, because the white pieces are more flexible here than the black pieces. White can decide when to move his pieces away from attacking d5, but black cannot decide, because as long as the white pieces remain here, black will have to keep defending the pawn. So white advances slowly but surely on the king's side. First he plays g3, not very committal yet. Could also be useful for the bishop to retreat, but also, well, first of all the bishop does retreat. Now the queen comes to the king's side, already signifying a potential kingside attack, but still keeping the pressure against the pawn. Now the pawn is even pinned for the moment. a6, and now he plays h3, king h2, very carefully. This is of course Karpov's style, as I think Ryan mentioned, but also this is the right way to play this kind of position, because white has complete control. Black cannot improve his position in any way. So white can take all the time he needs to carefully improve his position on the king's side. And now he plays the first really committal move, f4. But here it's already very concrete. He's threatening to trap the bishop. So black has to react, and he has to weaken his position in some way. He plays f6. Note that he cannot play rook d6 to provide squares for the bishop, because that would run into bishop b4. And then if white exchanges on e7, he will win the pawn on d5. So f6 was more or less forced, but of course this creates weaknesses, in particular the g6 square. Queen d1. So the queen is happy having induced that weakness. She returns to d1. And now he plays g4. And this is very awkward for black. Now he has to be ready for an eventual g5, also still be ready for an eventual f5. And also, of course, in this type of position, black has to make sure that his rook on d7 stays defended, because if he doesn't, then there could also be a potential e4 break that could be very strong. Well, he tries to defend with g5, but this of course weakens his kingside even more. But it's very hard to play this kind of position. At this point white may objectively not be winning, but he is clearly better because he has all the attacking options, and black has to play extremely precisely. But g5 is probably not the best move. King h1, a5, and now f5, bishop f7, and now e4 is a good move. Because, as I mentioned, now the rook on d7 has been stripped of one of the defenders, so it's insufficiently defended, and this allows white to play e4. So white just wins the pawn. So attacking the king was the second weakness. Didn't result in a direct checkmate against the black king, but it resulted in black having to weaken his kingside position, and this in turn allowed white to drive away one of the defenders of the d7 rook, and now he returns his attention to the first weakness on d5. And this is now lost. King g7 takes, queen c7, rook e2. And also black's king is still not entirely safe, so white is now winning. A little nice combination finishes the game. Rook takes e7, based on the fork on d6 to follow. Queen c4, b3. And black resigned because he has to move the queen, and then white can take the rook. He cannot take the rook immediately instead of b3, because then his own rook would also have been hanging. But now the black queen has to give up the attack against the d3 rook, so white is going to be able to capture on e7, winning. Yeah, that was a nice game by Karpov, and there are many similar games. In fact, there is a game by Botvinnik, a much older game, that is very, very similar to this one. And I'm sure Karpov knew that game. So this whole scenario is very typical. When all goes well for the side playing against the IQP, then you will be able to set up such a position where you attack the IQP with all your pieces. Your opponent will be forced to defend it, and then you can slowly advance on the king side, creating the second weakness, applying the principle of two weaknesses. Okay, sorry about talking for longer than I had planned, but I wanted to finish all the relevant plans. And we can go a little over time if you don't mind. The second seminar will only start in half an hour, so we still have time for some Q&A. Feel free to ask me any chess questions you may have. They may still be about the lesson, but can also be general chess questions. And let me scan the chat here if I missed anything. 5-card draw says I'm sounding Scandinavian. Yeah, I'm from Germany, so that's close. North Germany, in fact. And Q Tunneler, don't worry if you missed most of the seminar. We are going to upload a video, so you can watch the video later. Creeperbind, not sure about which position you're referring to with your line bishop g4. Maybe somewhere towards the end. Well, here there is no g4, because there's a pawn on g4. So it must have been earlier. Maybe in this position. Yeah, bishop g4 is an interesting option to exchange one of the defenders. But I'm not sure it would create a threat, because whenever you take on e6, maybe black would even be happy to reinforce the d5 pawn with another pawn. It's true that after this exchange the d7 rook would again be hanging, so maybe white could play e4 and maybe create a new isolated pawn by exchanging on d5. But note that then the d5 pawn would already be a passed pawn, so then the position may not be as clear anymore. In principle, it's a good idea for white to exchange light squared bishops here, but if it changes the pawn structure in this way, then it's probably not worth it for white. And the same is true about this position in the beginning. If you play bishop g4, black would not exchange himself, but he would let you exchange, and he would capture with a pawn on e6 to reinforce his d5 pawn. Yiha asked about the King's Indian attack. Well, this is a very different topic. I would say it's pretty similar to some of the classical lines from the King's Indian, only with colors reversed, of course. So if you want to learn those patterns, I can recommend looking at the King's Indian games by David Bronstein. He was the one who pioneered those structures that are also seen in the King's Indian attack. How to maintain energy during long games? Well, of course, it's very important to be physically fit, so doing some sport or just any physical exercise in general will always help. And during the game, well, you have to eat something to not run out of energy in that way. And most players like to get up at least once in a while, and I think that's also very useful, just to walk around a bit. As you get stronger, you will be able to think about the position even without looking at the board. So you don't have to stop thinking about the position while walking around. Okay, Karaf wants me to mention something here. We had thought about giving you some promo code. Let me look this up. Yeah, we have... Karaf is telling me we have a special offer here. If you use the promo code SEMINAR in all capitals. Let me spell that here. This is a special promo code that you can use on our site chessuniversity.com, and I think it will give you 20% off for any one course. So that's a special offer Karaf has just made here for you guys. And yeah, let me give you some links here to specific courses that could be interesting for your rating level. These are two courses that Karaf is suggesting here. One is by Kostya, I think, International Master Kostya Kawutsky, about positional sacrifices, positional pawn sacrifices in particular. So I guess he also includes some examples of the isolated queen's pawn, because, well, if you remember the first two examples I showed you today, we had this break d4, d5, at least as a short-term sacrifice. But in many positions this break can also be played as a long-term positional sacrifice. And the other course I've linked here is by International Master Nazi Paikidze. You may know her, she's the former US women's champion, and she's also a regular instructor at Chess University, and in that course we have collected her lessons from the Prodigy program. But let me return to your questions here, in case Ryan has not answered them already. Did I miss anything? What are the best books to go from sub 1600 to 2000? Or the books that helped you the most? Well, that's a good question. Let me think about that one. Silman's book may already be a bit too basic, I think, to make that leap. On the other hand, Dvoretsky's book, for example, may still be too advanced. There's a very good series by Artur Yusupov, former World Championship candidate, extremely strong player, originally from Russia, who now lives in Germany, very close to me in fact, and he has written a series of improvement books for different rating levels. So these also include, I think, 3 volumes for that rating range. I'm not sure about the English title. In German they are called what would be translated to Tiger Jump. But if you look for Yusupov improvement book, you will surely find them. The spelling in English, I think, is this one, Yusupov. Bishop Knight Rider says, I have made a monthly donation. Thank you, very much appreciated. Tips Monkey has a very general question. How do you improve thinking to think of your opponent's reply? Yeah, I'm afraid this one is too general for me to answer here. This is a very broad topic. For example, in the Prodigy program, we dedicate many lessons to this very topic, improving the thought process. Maybe the most important tip, if I can condense it into 1 or 2 lines, the most important tip is to always be very conscious of your opponent's ideas. Not only look at what you want to do, but also look at the position from your opponent's point of view and see if you can find ways to prevent their ideas. Which of White's openings are most likely to lead to IQP structures? I think starting with 1d4 is most likely to lead to IQP structures. And also, of course, if you start with 1c4 and then play d4 shortly after that, this would in fact mostly transpose to 1d4 openings, so that would be basically the same. And if you want to get IQP structures with black, for example, if you play the French defense, there's a good chance that you will get it. And against 1d4, as we have seen, if you play the Queen's Gambit accepted, this will more or less automatically, well, not automatically, but this will potentially lead to an IQP structure. With 1e4, yeah, there are also many lines with 1e4, but it depends on which lines exactly you play. For example, against the Sicilian, you could play c3 on the second move, and this could easily lead to an IQP structure, but not necessarily. Yeah, if you want to specialize in IQP structures, then I guess 5-card draw is right. Then 1e4 is a better move, because against many black lines you can find ways to get into IQP structures if you really want to. But this is not necessarily a course that I would recommend. I would recommend to know the plans in IQP structures and to know how to play them, but not necessarily to always play them, but so that you can decide when to go for the IQP structure. Because when you have really understood these kinds of positions, then you will be able to notice small details, and you will be able to see when the IQP structure favors you and when it doesn't, and then you can decide based on that. Do I feel it is a good idea to pick an opening by looking at the pawn structure from an endgame point of view? Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Not only from an endgame, but also from a middle game point of view. It doesn't make sense to play an opening that often leads to structures that you just do not like. For example, if you are uncomfortable in closed pawn structures, then it wouldn't be a good idea to play the French defense or the King's Indian defense, because those openings often lead to closed centers. So this is a very good idea. If you're interested in this topic in general, I can also recommend the book by Mauricio Flores Rios, who also already taught in the Prodigy program at Chess University. And he wrote a book called Chess Structures: A Grandmaster Guide. Now this is a quite advanced book, so if you're 1400 or 1500, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're close to 2000, then this could be interesting for you. And he discusses all the most important pawn structures, starting with this IQP structure that we looked at today, and, well, going over, for example, the most important structures arising from the French defense, those arising from the Ben-Oni, the Grünfeld, and so on. So for most openings there are typical structures, and for all those typical structures there will be typical plans. And if you know those plans, then you will know which openings you like, but more importantly, you will be able to play them well. Yeah, this is also the book that Algeciras had in mind. Yeah, the older one by Andy Soltis that Ryan mentions is also very good. And this is more basic, so maybe if you get a chance to take a look into the Flores Rios book, I guess the publisher Quality Chess will have a sample PDF online, so you can look into that to see if it's too advanced for you. And if it's too advanced, if it feels too complex in terms of the number of variations given and so on, then maybe Andy Soltis is the better choice for you. Yeah, Mauricio Flores Rios is the name. Thank you, Ryan. Okay, let me look if I missed anything in the YouTube chat. Yeah, we're going to record this. We're going to upload it. C. Thulu the Old asks, do you feel it is a good idea to pick up... okay, this one I already answered. I guess you posted it in both chats. If you play a lot of Blitz and Bullet, do I think this hurts your development? Not necessarily. I think it would hurt your development if you do it exclusively. So if you never play long games, then it will certainly hurt your development, because the only way to get better at what we may call real chess, meaning longer time controls, is to play longer time control games, because this is a different way of thinking. Blitz and Bullet will mostly train your pattern recognition skills and your intuition, because you don't really have time to calculate. But in longer games, you not only need intuition and pattern recognition, these will also be helpful in longer games, but you also need something else, which is precise calculation and careful evaluation of the position. And this you can only train by really playing longer games. If you do a mix of both, that can be fine, but I wouldn't recommend only playing Blitz and Bullet. Yeah, the name of the book I mentioned is Chess Structures, a Grandmaster Guide. One F4, well, this would potentially lead to structures from the Dutch defense with reversed colors. So if you're playing the Dutch with black, this can be a shortcut, so that you don't have to spend so much time learning white openings. But I wouldn't recommend to play that exclusively, because by studying a greater variety of structures, playing a greater variety, or by just playing one mainline opening, either one d4 or one e4, you will be exposed to a greater variety of pawn structures, and this will help your overall chess development. Okay, if there are no further questions, I guess we should clear the channel for today's second free seminar. If you have time, you can attend that as well, although it is intended for lower rated players. So our second seminar today is intended for players in the 900 to 1500 ELO rating range. It's going to be taught by my Chess University colleague, FIDE Master Dalton Perrine, and it's going to start in about 13 minutes from now. And his topic is understanding the importance of forcing moves, which is a very important one. Forcing moves are those moves that leave your opponent with only a very limited set of replies. So this is the basic of calculation in chess. Would some openings overlap with 1f4? Well, 1f4 could in principle still transpose to other openings, but if black replies 1d5, then that's pretty unlikely. Then you will have a structure, a Dutch with reversed colors. So that's why I think it's limited, as Ryan also says. Okay, thank you very much everybody for your interest in our free seminar here. Check out chessuniversity.com for all that we offer, and yeah, maybe you want to attend the second seminar starting in 12 minutes as well. Thanks to everybody. Goodbye.